everybody. Welcome. We're starting late, so I'm going to start things out right away. This is the panel on pilot projects, and pilot projects have been taking off on basic income. They're going on around the world in so many ways and so many different guises right now. So this panel is about pilot projects, really very, very broadly conceived, in any sort of trial and error effort to learn something or demonstrate something about basic income. And we're going to do it not in a formal presentation sense, but in more of a roundtable or discussion and question and answer sense. So first, I'll ask the panelists some questions, then maybe they'll ask each other some questions, and then we will all ask everybody else some questions about it all. So we'll start here with the first person in order, Minna Ylikännö, if close enough. From Finland. So my first question was going to be to everybody, except Sarath answered it this morning, so I don't know if you abbreviated one. The first question is, tell us about how your work relates to pilot projects broadly conceived. And what have you been doing working on pilot projects?
Should I start?
Yes.
Okay. I work in the Social Insurance Institution of Finland, aka Kela, which has been planning, implementing, and now is evaluating the Finnish basic income experiment. I work there as a senior researcher, and I'm responsible for organizing the evaluation of the experiment. The scientific leader of the research group is Professor Ylikännö, who is working at the University of Turku. I'm then working in Kela as kind of a partner to organize the research there. And of course doing some research too.
Yeah. And Jenna van Draanen, how does your work relate to basic income pilot projects?
So I'm a researcher, but I'm not a pilot project or basic income researcher. I'm a mental health researcher. And because of my interest in mental health, I'm convinced that we need universal basic income. So I advocate.
Just slow down, a little louder and a little slower.
Okay. I'm a researcher, but not about basic income. And because of my mental health research, I'm convinced that we need a basic income. So that's what I advocate for in my spare time. So I'm part of the Basic Income Canada Network. We're an advocacy group, we're a nonprofit, we're made up of normal citizens, and we advocated for basic income in Canada. And one day, and we advocated very hard and very well, I think, and one day I woke up and they announced that there was going to be a pilot project in Ontario instead. So my experience is of asking for one thing and getting something else. And so I have
Very different.
Lots of concerns about the ethics of pilot projects. The project in Ontario was cancelled prematurely and left a lot of people in very desperate situations. So so I didn't administer or evaluate any of the pilot project that was happening in Ontario, but our group is now working quite closely with former pilot project recipients, and we are kind of, I think, cleaning up the mess that the pilot project left.
The government.
So anybody who saw Sarath Davala in the morning session knows that he was one of the administrators of the now very influential Indian pilot project from 2011, and which helped really spark this wave of support for basic income that's been going on. It's been serving as a model for some of the other pilot projects. Anything to add on that right now, Sarath?
Yeah, all the discussion that was happening, that was a women's trade union called Self-Employed Women's Association, which initially started. Actually, they didn't in 2010, 2010, when they were discussing this, they were not talking about basic income at all. They were coming from the fact that they work in the informal sector. Their starting point was that our members are not receiving the benefits they are supposed to get because the delivery system is very poor. The pipes are clogged. So to clear those pipes, maybe unconditional cash transfer is a better solution. So they were coming from there. But from there we evolve into basic income advocates as we are today. That's all I wanted to add.
Okay, Joy Ponader?
Ponader.
Ponader?
Yeah.
The same question to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Guy. Karl. So I would say I'm clearly misplaced on this panel, or my function
Broadly
is
conceived.
to throw,
Private projects.
or to
broadly
throw the
conceived.
view on the panel, because our campaign that I co-founded in Berlin is clearly not a pilot, it's a campaign, but it is disguised as a pilot. So, and perhaps that's also an argument that we will have today. What we do is, or what the team that I was former a part of does, is crowdfunding money, and whenever we have 12,000 euros, we raffle it out to a random person and say, try it out for 1 year and tell us what happens. So like sending out a pioneer group into the mountains and say, just have a look and come back and tell us how this mountain looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And I also implemented another campaign that's just like a little bit like the Finland experiment from the setup, but very small and funded by private people. But perhaps we can talk about that later.
And how many people are receiving a Grundeinkommen today, right now?
So, receiving the 1 year basic income is like 250 people over the course of 4.5 years. But receiving the idea, because I see it as a campaign, way more important, is that over 1 million people signed up on the website and all were asked the question, what would you do if you were the lucky winner?
Yeah.
And so had to think about it, had to fantasize about being in a society with basic income. And that's mainly the core. We just do the 250 people, so we can drag in others to wanting to be part of this group.
Okay.
And as to influence society with this virus of I also want that.
And then at the end of the table, Annie Miller, tell us about how your work relates to basic income pilot projects.
Right. I'm Annie Miller. I had the good fortune to be at the first BIAN conference, and before that to help set up a basic income trust in London to speak to the Westminster Parliament. Since the referendum for Scotland in 2014, the population has become more politicised than ever before and more aware of what sort of society it wants. 4 local authorities in Scotland have combined together and applied for funds from the Scottish Government to plan a feasibility study for a basic income pilot in Scotland. Now it's only halfway through that, and it's just issued a report to say what's happening. A team of the people who were on the steering group went to Tampere last August and wrote a report on how helpful that was, on how the context for the pilot is very important. For instance, it can frame the focus for the questions. For instance, in Scotland we have enormous poverty and inequality problems, and the local authorities are really focused on that, rather than the emancipatory or the work incentive effects. But I hope they're going to collect data for those as well, so that we can analyse those effects as well. You probably want me to say more about this later, and this is just an introductory one,
Yes.
is it? Can I just say that I'm very fortunate. I have a basic income, and it's called a pension, and it's absolutely fantastic. That when I retired, and with good health, a good circle of family and friends, enough money so you're not worrying about paying your next bill, and if you have a passion in life to get you out of bed in the morning, life is bliss. Well, I mean, you've still got the ordinary sorrows of life, but it's as good as it can ever get, and I wish all of you a basic income of your own to enjoy this as well.
All right, thank you very much. Now, I have to confess, I did not organize this panel. I was asked to be the chair, and I am perhaps a dangerous person to ask to chair a panel of this type, because maybe I'd rather be a panelist, because I have an agenda on this topic. I've recently published a book called A Critical Discussion of Basic Income Experiments, and it talks about how difficult it is to run the technical aspects of a basic income experiment, that it has difficulty answering the questions we most want to know. And the questions it can address, it often addresses indirectly or incompletely, and it tends to have a streetlight effect where it shines a light on some questions that it's good at giving answers for, and even if those are not the most important questions to be asked. Then there's a double problem. that once the results are released to the public, they are so technical and so divorced from what the public wants to know that they're vulnerable to misunderstanding, to oversimplification, and to spin by political opponents. That's what the book is about. I forgot to pack copies of it when I came here. You cannot get one down there. However, an early version of it is available for free online, and making money for my publisher is not a big deal for me, so I'm perfectly happy if you look at the free version online. If you need a copy, I can get you a copy of the final and good version. But that's the point I'm making in my book, and I learned something about oversimplification as I tried to write this book. Because when I was giving this talk that led to this book, a lot of people were like, well, what I learned, what your talk is about is how we should never have experiments. Like, no, that's not what I said. I just said they're difficult to do and they have all these problems. And if we wanted to do them well, we have to point these problems out. Then by the time we had a workshop on it, that Sarath was there, we got Robert van der Veen saying to me, Karl, you're not making a strong enough case why we should nevertheless have experiments, despite these problems. Because I was then trying not to go overboard with saying we should. So I tried to take this neutral position. I'm not saying we should or should not have them, just that we have these problems. Now, which brings me to my agenda, bringing me to Finland, because Finland had, I think, a very good experiment, but it has fallen victim to all of these things: spin, oversimplification of results, and distracting people's attention from what's most important. And also, one thing I think is a form of spin is the constantly moving goalposts. So we have, in the 1970s, when they did the original NIT experiments in the United States, they thought, well, of course people are going to work less if you do this. How much less? Will that make it unsustainable? But when the results came out, people were like, well, people work more than 1 minute less per week on average. That means these are a failure. Now you get the Finnish experiments. They found people worked the same. And then now the opponents are saying, well, this is a failure because people didn't work more. So you've had that problem. How do you react to that and other problems that you've had with releasing these results in the media? That's my question.
Well, we can't solve the problems with media. It's impossible. Well, first of all, perhaps the problem we had throughout the whole experiment from the first kind of stage of the planning was the lack of time. We didn't have enough time for planning, not for implementing. We had only 2 years' time for the experiment. Then the government wanted to have the first results before the end of the reign, and we're going to have elections, parliamentary elections, in a couple of weeks, in 14th of April, and they wanted to have first results already in February. Even the experiment ended in the end of December, so it was very fast, and we had to think really carefully what to publish at that time point, because we knew whatever we published, it's going to be a discussion about whether it's a failure or a success, due to the very high interest of the politicians at that time to the experiment. Not in 2 years when people received basic income, nobody was interested in that in Finland, but when the elections came nearer and nearer, then of course the interest grew bigger, and that I've noticed not just in basic income but other research projects, whatever the media wants to tell people, they tell it. Even if I try to formulate it as simple as I can, it's going to be printed out otherwise. And for example, in Finland, the experiment was not cut kind of what was in media, in international media, that it was kind of
they said it was cancelled.
Cancelled after 2 years. It wasn't.
Yeah, it just came to an end.
Everybody asked me that if that was cancelled. I said no, it wasn't. But it's we try to do our best as researchers, but I think it's well, it's a very difficult question. But yeah, now in 1 year we're going to publish the last results, and perhaps that should have been so that we would have published only kind of the last results. But we had to, because the minister wanted to have preliminary results. They seem to be the final results for the media.
Now, Jenna, in Canada, it's been an interesting situation because the story has been completely different, because the story has become how horrible these people are who canceled the experiment, which is a totally different media story than we were expecting. are you following that, and how is this affecting what little results you can get of this abbreviated study?
Yeah, so I would say we've been trying to make the best of a bad situation that way. I think that so we had a left-ish government that implemented this pilot project, and then a very right government got elected and canceled it. And they were vilified, as Karl referred to in the media a little bit, for that decision, and for a host of other decisions that they made at the time that were pretty socially regressive. And so what we did to kind of use that, I guess, advantageously to move the agenda of basic income forward, still in this terrible situation, as a network we started a petition to try to get the government to reinstate it, to try to make it, to show the public will, essentially, for starting the pilot project back up again. And we got thousands of signatures, including 1,500 signatures of pilot project recipients themselves. And so it was, I think, very powerful, and we did get quite a bit of media attention. And those pilot project recipients then went on to do a lot of other things. To their credit, they self-organized, and they've been organizing a lot. They've done speaker series. They have, you might have seen it, there's a campaign on Twitter, Humans for Basic Income, and there's pictures and stories of people's lives and how they were changed. So they are trying to tell their own stories through speaking opportunities, through social media, of how their lives were changed because the government has now said that they're not going to, not only are they not going to give them a basic income, but they're not going to publish any of the results, even the preliminary results that might exist from the little bit of time that the pilot project was in place. So the project recipients, some of them are trying to self-organize and to show what it's done for them, anecdotally at least, nevertheless. And as an organization, the Basic Income Canada Network, so we took those 1,500 people that signed the petition, along with thousands of others, but 1,500 that were pilot project recipients, and we followed up with them, and we said, do you want to participate in a voluntary survey? We as an organization have email addresses for 1,500 people who self-reported that they were part of the pilot project. So we surveyed them, and informally somewhat, in the sense that we were not part of the government, we had nothing to do with the pilot project, except for a vested interest in it because we're the Basic Income Canada Network. And so we have this Signposts of Success survey where we got people to self-report what the results were. We had, of those 1,500 people, 424 responded. And so it was just released about a month ago, so hot off the press. I'm here today to tell you all about Signposts for Success. Yeah, and I mean, as you might expect, people were incredibly impacted by the money that they got, even for a short amount of time. Shall I talk about that now? I feel like I'm talking a little too much. Maybe I'll give you 3 bullet points. So one of the changes was 58% of people improved their housing situation in the time that they were on the Basic Income pilot project. 74% said that they were able to make healthier food choices. And I think one of the most important ones for me, anyway, is the psychological distress. So 88% of people said that they had less stress and anxiety when they were on the Basic Income pilot. And so a lot of people, it was a means-tested, it wasn't really a Basic Income pilot, it was a means-tested negative income tax. So people who were on it were low income, and they got a little bit more money than they previously did in most cases. So they were responding to the increase in money, to what that did for their lives, and also the decrease in conditionality, because if they were earning money any other way, it would have been much more conditional than the negative income tax that they received.
And I should add that I've been to the Basic Income Canada Network meetings, and they've had designated spokespeople from the pilot project sample, and they were great, because they can do something that none of us can, none of the activists or the academics that are typically in this movement can do. They can say, I was desperately poor, and then I got a basic income, and here's what happened to me. And it was just fantastic, their contribution. Now, Sarath, my impression of India, as we're still on the question of spin, misuse, and misunderstanding of an oversimplification of the results, my impression of India, and you can correct me if it's not as good as my impression is, but my impression is that your pilot project was relatively invulnerable to this, and I think the reason was because critics weren't paying you much attention. So it was the people on your side who were getting all the word out. Is that correct? And you could say anything else, or was it maybe it was just your own brilliant media management? I don't know.
I wish I could say it's my brilliant media management. Well, at the time we did this pilot project, I think people hardly knew about basic income in India. So neither we had supporters nor any opponents to that. It was completely something new, and when we went and tried to involve the government, and so that we designed the whole thing so that at some point of time government should take up, because the amount we decided based on the poverty line, we stitched it into the existing poverty discussion. So, so government actually was like, okay, they didn't say no to it, they didn't say yes to it, but they said that, okay, you do it, we will follow. So, we did the study. I mean, after that, we were very enthusiastic, but I think nobody was really paying much attention to it. So, we had very strong evidence to show what actually happened in the villages. But it's only after the politicians took up the issue and they started talking about it as if they were the first to talk about it. Completely closing their eyes to the fact that there was a pilot and there's a book and it's and there's a network. So then I said, okay, we started going to those politicians and started talking. We did this work basically for that. And I think that's how curiosity came about our study, and then people started publishing our findings, discovering our study, discovering the book. And then first came the Sikkim announcement that a small state province called Sikkim declared that we would like to roll out, if we win the election, roll out basic income. And then now the main opposition party, Rahul Gandhi, announced that we will do a kind of a negative income tax model, which itself is quite radical because it's going to go to 250 million people. So, yeah, there are many people there. So that's how it is. I mean, so well, pilot has its place, but I think politics has to really take the whole thing forward.
Mm-hmm. Now, Joy, I think you should take more credit, because I think actually all of these studies are really also campaigns, and that anything that is trial and error is really a form of an experiment. And unless you're really trying to deceive people into thinking it is more than what it is, or something different than what it is, it's a contribution to our understanding. But now, so I think what you're doing is great. And also the campaign that goes along with it, I think, is really exciting. As you get these stories from people, and you collect people's experiences with basic income, you're getting, of course, people with basic income, not just from the poorest of the poor, like in Canada, but from a whole range of backgrounds, which makes it interesting. You're probably getting some very poor and some very middle class and everything. As you get these stories, what is your problem with getting people to understand them and getting the results understood and paid attention? Do you have more trouble just getting people to pay attention to your little project, or are you being attacked the way Finland and Ontario have been attacked?
No, not at all. We're very, very blessed and in a privileged situation, I would say, with that. And I'm very happy to hear, Jenna, from what you... Jenna or Jenna? Jenna, what you experienced in Ontario, not that it was cancelled. I also talked on the phone to some guy who got this basic income in Ontario, and what I'm happy to hear is that you made a campaign out of it. So it started as a pilot and it became a campaign. And I would say perhaps in our, I might be understating, so in our effort it started as a campaign and could become a pilot. Actually the team is working on a pilot where 100 people are really randomly selected and not out of the basic income church, which is one of the downsides of our campaign, if you would like to see it as a pilot. And actually, we don't have at all a problem with the media or whatever. We had the strategic approach to really do not step into any battle zones or war zones of the basic income discussion. So we never talked about financing, how to finance it. We only talked about the personal experience, and we actually found exactly the same what you referenced to. I once had the privilege to facilitate a meeting where 25 of the winners came together in one room. So for the first time it was not my basic income but our basic income. So it had a glimpse of an interpersonal thing in the room. And you could grasp it. I'm facilitating group discussions a lot, and I never had a group discussion where grabbing attention, being the first one to speak, where so less ego was in the room. And actually, when people talked about the experience, nearly every time everybody else nodded. So they could refer to the basic income feeling. They called it themselves the basic income feeling. Or someone called it the experience. So they technically said, we are feeling more calm. We're living the same life. Many of them buy more healthier food, like you said. Many of them improve their living situation, not so much by increasing their consumption, but decreasing their expectations. So people sold their cars or moved into cheaper flats because they really like the idea of being independent and autonomous. They learned it from us. So I would say what we found out is it was more de-learning things that we had been conditioned to in our lives, in the power structures that we had been put in. And it's also de-learning for the people who are supervising, as the crowd who is looking on the experiment. So giving the people some ideas that it could be different than they expect. That perhaps because many people have an opinion about basic income, this cannot work. And we don't want to convince people that it can work. We absolutely are happy if we make them consider perhaps it could be working, perhaps I'm wrong. That's totally enough for us. And perhaps the last point that I want to add is the thing that makes me the most happy is that 5 years ago articles in the media about basic income had illustrations of piled money or an animal that is called Faultier in Germany, which means lazy animal. Or someone sitting in the sun with a pina colada in a mat. And now it's the faces of our winners. So now the media have, which they really like, they have someone they can go to and say, so you have a basic income, as you said. How does it feel? Like you did some minutes ago. And we saw from the reaction in the audience that this is really connecting people. If they hear you speaking, what a bliss this is to get up in the morning with a task, then they can de-learn their pre-expectations they have on the topic, which I would say is the first step if we want to gain support for the idea.
Okay, so Annie, now the question, everybody has a very different experience here. Now, of course, the same theme of the question here of avoiding misunderstanding, oversimplification, and spin of the results. You're in a different position than the rest because you're in Scotland. You're just designing this experiment with much more experience than people have, gaining of these recent experiments of the other pilot projects going. And I know that in Scotland, Jamie Cook has been really interested in these sorts of issues, and I've discussed them with him before. So what kind of steps are you taking in the design in Scotland to try to avoid things like the streetlight effect and misuse and misunderstanding?
Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I'm not involved in the design process. Each of the 4 local authorities have allocated 3 officials to form the steering group. Now, they have been taking advice from all sorts of people. They were at Tampere last year. They took advantage of meeting up with people from Keeler, from talking with Sarath and so on. And so they got a lot of important information about how to avoid issues. And one of the issues to avoid is this misinformation, and they're doing that by putting out information on a regular basis. Now, from my point of view, they don't actually give much away. And it may be because, for instance, 2 years ago, one of the key Conservative members of the Scottish Parliament wrote an article saying what a good thing basic income was going to be. And then 3 months later, the Scottish National Party took it on board, so suddenly it's no way, this is terrible, we can't have this. So this is an example of the sorts of responses that we get. Now, from my point of view, we still don't know what the objectives of the experiment are, except it's going to point to poverty and inequality. We don't know what models they're going to choose. We don't know what samples they're going to have. Are they saturation samples or random samples, maybe stratified as well? And what sort of data are they going to collect? Now, my main concern is that I really want them to have different levels of basic income. I don't think any other experiment has said, you know, how much effect you get with this level, how much with the bigger level, how much with the bigger level. Now, the problem with that sort of experiment is that some people have to put up with small basic incomes. But if you do it over time, someone has a small basic income in the first period, could have a much larger one in the second, and it could be shared around in that way. So I really want there to be an experiment to see what the different effects are. The other thing I want them to do is not just say we're going to collect data on the poverty and inequality. I want them to collect data on all aspects of this, because doing the experiment costs an enormous amount of money. The marginal cost of collecting extra data is relatively small. It's not cheap, but it's still relatively small. So the bigger database we can get, because that's what the pilot project is. It's a way of generating data which can then be stored and analysed over future years. And it could be a wonderful resource for doing that. So those are my two caveats: an experimental situation and plenty of data on all aspects. All I can say is that the Scottish team are taking the planning side very seriously. They are aware that you have to look not just at designing the experiment, but the data you collect, how you analyse it, how it tests hypotheses. You don't want to be another example of collecting data and then find you can't test your hypotheses with it. And also looking out to the dissemination stage. They want to have some control over all stages of that. There's more about it. If you want to look up their website, it's www.basicincome.scot. And all their recent reports are available on that website, and you can download them. So please look at them.
Scott.
www.basicincome.scot.
Karl, I just want to add something.
Okay,
A small
sure.
thing.
Yeah.
Now, if we look at the pace of basic income discussion around the world in this decade, the first half was relatively silent. It was not what Karl talks about, the third wave of experiments, the third wave of interest. When we in Namibia did the study in 2008, there was hardly any press. There was hardly what we have now, well-entrenched supporters and opponents.
Yeah.
At that time, nobody had. Similarly, when we started in 2011, until when our results came out, there was not much of interest. It was only within the basic income community. They said, wow, pilot is going on, how is it going, blah, 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 and all that. We hardly confronted the opponents. But fortunately, we were at that time. Now I think anybody does any experiment, I think it has to face the media and all the opponents and the supporters. And I think Finland was the worst victim of. They were praised for the wrong reasons and criticized for the wrong reasons. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, but I tell you, when those two pilot projects happened, first in Namibia and then in India, it was for those of us who were working in basic income news at the time. It was like, wow, there's real articles. There's like real news. There's something to report. So that's how I began to notice there's an uptick. And then right after that, you had those two citizens' initiatives in Europe going on, one in Switzerland, one in the EU. And it really was happening from them. And that is just built into this wave we're seeing now. So now my agenda is finished. I highly recommend you read my book, 45,000 words, about all the problems you can have with the UBI experiments, and there's no easy answers. So that's out of the way. So now what I want to do, before I go to the floor, I want to ask a more open question, everyone. It's now just ask the question, you answer the question you wish I'd asked you before. So I give you a chance to say anything you want to make sure you say about your particular experience before I go to the floor. And if you don't have a lot to say, you can make it short and get to the floor sooner. Okay? So Minna, we start with you again.
Okay, thank you. Well, in Finland we know that Karl has also been criticizing our small pilot project, and I think what you could have asked is what we actually wanted to have in Finland. We had a research group planning the experiment in 2015 and 16, and actually what they suggested first was something quite different than what we had. They wanted to have different levels of basic income, they wanted to have the taxation system within the experiment, of course, and they wanted to have different kind of population groups, for example, low-income earners, housewives, students in the experiment. What we then ended up having were 2,000 long-term unemployed due to lack of time. There was no time to make systems work. And I've been saying that to make kind of a Nordic welfare state social security system more simple is very not simple. It's very complicated to make something simpler. We have the ICT systems, we pay out, for example, from Kela, we pay out 100 different benefits to people. And to put up a system to pay out the new benefits takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. We would have needed a lot of legislative changes, we would have needed much more time. So what we wanted was something different, what we got was really good. We have good research agenda, research setting, we can do very good research, we're going to have reliable results, but of course if there's going to be more experiments, perhaps they can be built up then based on the experiments we have now from our experience in Finland.
Okay. Jenna?
Yeah, it wasn't necessarily a question that didn't get asked, but just something that we haven't covered yet. It's important to me is the morality of starting something that you don't finish and the ethics of experimenting in general, but then the vulnerability, the political vulnerability of an experiment. So I think one of the issues that I've seen in the basic income movement is criticism from the left. And in particular in Canada, they're worried that because unconditional cash transfers are so simple, yes, that's their power and that's their beauty, but that's also their volatility. It can just be taken away like that. It's hard to dismantle hospitals and libraries and buses, but it's easy to just erase a line, a payment system. And so I think that has been on my mind lately, that criticism, I think, from the left is real. And it's real in the sense that the implications in the pilot project are that the government changed and they just stopped. Even though there was a research institution behind this, even though there was a bureaucracy behind the pilot project, so it wasn't quite so easy just to delete a line. But I do think that, so there's 4 pilot project participants who have tried to take this to court. They're trying to essentially kind of sue the government for because they were promised to be part of an experiment for 3 years, and the conservative government that got into office, in fact, in their campaigning, said they were going to continue the project, and then a matter of months after getting elected, stopped it. And so I think just as quickly as it came about, it was erased, and I think that's dangerous, and I think it's real, and we should try to come up with more ethical systems of ensuring that if you sign up for something, if your life has changed dramatically overnight for the better, it then can't be taken away the next night. Because I think a lot of the support that we might gain from the left, I think that this unfortunate cancellation actually kind of amplifies the point of how simple it could be to cancel something that really should be completely unacceptable to cancel midway through. The unconditionality of it, it was almost amplified how conditional it truly was because it was just canceled so abruptly. So they are trying to come up with a class action lawsuit. They had a recent case in January that was denied. So the fight to reinstate the money for the pilot participants continues, but not at all hopeful that it'll come back. So those are some of my gripes.
Okay, Sarath.
Actually, Karl has been unfair to himself when he said he's not the right person, because I've read the book. His book is very well written, very good analysis of different pilots, and even as he is a passionate advocate of the basic income, he was also passionately neutral in that book. So his book actually enhances the stature of our community, that we are not just people who are very syrupy about basic income all the time, but we are also people who are actually being very critical of ourselves And so that is the role of that the book plays. Though I had my disagreements with Karl. Having said that, I have been reflecting on the pilots and the role of a pilot, because we are also actually actively working with the parties and different spaces on this issue. Now, I feel that a pilot has a role, but we should neither overestimate its capacity nor underestimate its value. It has a role in the overall scheme of things. At the end of the day, I believe that it's only a state, it's only the government which can bring the scale that we are expecting, kind of a rollout. It's only the government can do. So private initiatives can only do a demonstration effect and add to the discourse. Now, now, for example, now politicians have come forward, and then now they started using our data to say that this is a good thing, okay, which is a very good thing, which means that we can't put the evidence in the front and politics behind. Politics has to be in the front, and evidence has to back up and give the push to politics. So now that the Congress government has announced, and Congress government is actually saying that we will, before we roll out what we have in mind, we will do a pilot. A pilot was done in MP, but our model we want to test out before we roll out across the nation. So I think their pilot is very useful, because they are going to sort out the nitty-gritty of how to do it, how much to do, and how to do the targeting and all that. These are all very difficult questions. So I would only add that evidence has only so much role. In all my advocacy last 7-8 years, very few people have actually asked me that, do you have evidence to say that basic income will work? Because their support to basic income or opposition to basic income is not based on the question of evidence at all. They have an opinion. They know that it won't work. See, a barber has a skill, and not all of us can do that, you know. But everybody has an opinion about basic income. You know, people who don't know anything about it, who have not studied the welfare system, who don't understand what is wrong with the current system, have a very strong opinion that this is going to destroy this economy. This is a worst idea. This is going to cause all kinds of things that we have been discussing, the drunkards and I mean, they're rich, very rich in their imagination is all this matter.
Okay, Joy.
Yeah, what comes next? Thanks for this lovely question. Actually, the campaign I'm working on as a next step for Germany, where there's a very vivid discussion. So perhaps one of the most significant signs that you can see how vivid the discussion in Germany is not only that all political parties now start to discuss about it and to put it into their policy considerations, but also the My Basic Income campaign we started 4.5 years ago has not only 1 million users, but more than 100,000 people donate every month, a regular donation. So it's funding 30 full employed people now on the campaign, working every day, Monday to Thursday. We have a 4-day labor week on the topic of basic income. And we can reach out to those more than 1 million people by a newsletter with one click. So spread out news about basic income. And I want to use this power to have a pilot in Germany, a state-driven pilot, as you say, because you have limitations when you want to crowdfund a pilot. But we will do the link. My colleague Laura is also here in the room, who is setting up this project with me. At the moment we have 4 people as a nucleus for a project. We will use the link that we will introduce the pilot by a plebiscite, a referendum. So we will do a people's initiative like the one in Switzerland, but not for introducing basic income, but for introducing a basic income pilot, which we want to win, which is not a campaign people's initiative, but we really want to win it. And we have steady, when you do polls in Germany, you have a steady leaning towards I like the idea of basic income instead of I don't like it, or 50% in the population. But you have a steady 70% in the polls of people saying I want to see pilots implemented. So I have open questions and I want to see pilots implemented. So we have it's a low-hanging fruit from my opinion, from my perspective now, really to take the people's vote on a pilot, and also by this try to avoid problems that you had in Ontario, that you had in Finland, because the first step now is we build up a scientific team to create how the pilot should be, so that you research on the right questions, that you get the right design, that you are not only focusing on social economics but well-being, all the learnings from all the experiments that you are planning or already did. Then we will put it into a referendum, and then the government has to do it the way the people want it. And they cannot stop it anymore, even if the government changes, because a people's vote is a people's vote and cannot be abolished.
Well, I'm sorry, I have to respond to this. That's great idea. That's a great idea for a campaign. I think the one thing that is essential when you say, well, first the campaign just that will boost basic income, just the campaigning for this, but is actually getting the pilot project you want out of it is so very valuable. The one piece of advice I have about the pilot project you want: make sure to specify the budget, and make sure the budget is larger than all of the other pilot projects that have been done. So you can do what Annie has just been recommending, have one with the adding people is actually the least expensive thing. Once you, the administrative apparatus, once you get that in place, the largest experiment that's been done so far is called Sign Dime, Seattle and Denver Income Maintenance Experiment in the 1970s. That had 5,000 people. You could do one that's at least that large, or larger.
10,000 euro and
Yeah.
city.
Yes.
And if you could do one saturation site as part of that, I think that's very important.
Welcome on the advisory board.
All right. I would be glad.
Oh, we were 6,000 people.
Yeah, yeah. Well, sorry. That's the largest one. I'm sorry. That's the largest one that's been done in a wealthy country. There are, yes, there have been larger ones in smaller countries. Of course, the Give Directly one is huge in Kenya. But in a yeah, and that's actually a pretty offensive slip by me. It's like, forgetting. Of course, I meant less developed countries. That's pretty crappy. Anyway, Annie, you're last up.
I'd like to tell you a bit about what the steering group is doing now. They've just published a report which is telling us about the project work streams. They've got 5 work streams. One is called evaluability assessment, and that's to do with working out what the questions they want to ask, trying to work out what the models they're going to use, what data they're going to collect, and also to try and cost it. Now, I've heard them discuss that there might be 4,000 subjects over 3 years, and I've worked out that's going to cost something like £100 million. That's the gross cost. Of course, there could be net savings and so on, but that's a lot of money. The second thing they have been doing is they've had a research and evidence, and they've got someone to review the evidence of the how much poverty there is, the inequality, research that's been done on labour supply and things like that, and they've just submitted a report, or about to submit a report to the steering group. So they're not just focusing on that, they're taking other sources of evidence as well. And I assume they'll be taking microsimulation evidence, because that's an important input. They both are ways of generating data, but they have different limitations and different strengths. The third thing they're doing is engaging with the Department of Work and Pensions and Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. Now, the Department of Work and Pensions is the institution that delivers the pensions to the population. And so far they've been very uninterested, very resistant. Now, in a sense, that doesn't matter too much, because under the 2003 Local Councils Scotland Act, local authorities are entitled to set up new benefits if they are to contribute to the well-being of their constituents. So that's fine, they're entitled to do it. If they make it in the form of a child benefit, that's not taken into account for means-tested benefits, so people are actually better off. So, in some ways, you don't need the DWP. You can set up your own institutional way of delivering it, and then it would be taken into account when people apply for means-tested benefits, and people will be floated off their means-tested benefits. The thing is, you can work out how much the DWP would owe the Scottish Government for doing that, but whether they would actually pay up or not is a different matter. Now, with HMRC, we thought they'd be more intractable, but the little birdie told me recently they've actually shown some interest. But this is a more difficult part for implementing it, because you can pay out money, but how do you replicate the taxation effects that you might want? For instance, it would be good if we really, for a change, had a very progressive income tax system in the UK compared with the one we've got. So my plan B, which I keep telling everyone about but may not be necessary, is that you could actually work out where you would want people to be on a certain income level, and so you could have a pre-taxed benefit, basic income, which gets them to the level of basic income after taxation had taken place. Now, it's been specified that there must be no detriment. In other words, nobody can be made worse off. Not even rich people, which I think is a bit rich. That we can't actually take money off rich people. So there'll come a time when they just get zero. It sort of peters out. But and the other thing is, although they say Scotland is the most devolved country in the world, I suspect that's because it is the only country in the world that's devolved, because it has very few powers. It has less powers, certainly, than any of the states in the United States. Some say it has even less powers than the local authorities in England. It certainly has very limited powers over taxation. It can't do away with any of the tax exemptions and allowances, which are so inequitable and tend to favour people in accordance with people's incomes. They can't control the personal allowance, which is very important in this. They can't even tax other income apart from earnings. So they've got very limited control over the taxation. So if the Revenue and Customs are willing to come in and help to control this would be a big step forward. The fourth one is called communications and engagement, and this is their way in which they are communicating with media, with other people, voluntary sector organisations and so on. And one of these is CBINS, the Citizens Basic Income Network Scotland, which is a charity, a tiny charity, but under the Scottish Government plans, the steering group is not allowed to do public advertising, and they're not allowed to educate the public. All they can do is set this up. So people like CBINS and the Royal Society for the Arts and so on, we're going to have a very important role to educate people. So we want to do it by training ambassadors who will then go and talk to their other spheres of interest. But the important thing is we want them then to go and speak to their elected representatives, to the councils who will sign off the project when it goes eventually to the Scottish Government, to the members of the Scottish Parliament, to the MPs. That's where the change will happen. And I think one MP said, or MSP said, I've had 25 letters on this subject. You know, is there a revolution going on? I don't know what the subject was, but 25 letters represents a revolution. So you don't need too many people going to their councillors and saying, look, this is what we want. But making sure that they are an informed public and that they brief the representatives, because it's no good them talking rubbish. One of the problems we have in this is that a lot of people criticise us who have no idea what they're talking about. And the most important criticisms are the ones we do know. So when Karl criticises pilots, then we know he's talking truth. But I mean, but he qualifies it, so that's even better. But someone who just says, oh, you know, a basic income and tries to define it, hasn't even read the literature, you can't believe a word they say. And the last work stream is project governance. And they've set up a group of councillors, 3 from each of the 4 local authorities, and they have to let them know what's going on, what likely budgets are and so on. And they also have to work out what their budget is. They had £250,000, that's £250,000 from the Scottish Government to help the planning process. And of course it's going to be a lot more of that if it goes ahead. And so they have to account for this to the councillors and to others to say how much is being spent on what. I note other people saying that we've got a problem with it being taken over. What we need is some constitutional safeguards. We need cross-party support before something is implemented. To say, and then constitution to say that this is sacrosanct and it can't just be taken away either from individuals, and also I think you need safeguards to say that it has to be inalienable from debt collection. You can't have it sequestered, you can't even use it for a mortgage, because if you have negative equity you've lost your income stream for life. So there's got to be other safeguards as well. And Yeah, I think that's all.
Okay, great. So now I want to go to questions from the floor. And there's very little time, and I want to get as many voices as possible. So they must be questions, no speeches, not even a speech as a preamble to the question. And also to the answers. I want the answers to be really short too, so we can get as many people as possible. Okay, we'll start.
Can people say who they are as well?
Okay,
We haven't had that.
sure. Say your name. Okay, first, woman in the center, and then I'll collect other hands while the woman in the center is asking her question. That's you.
I'm a woman.
Okay. Okay.
So it's related to what you were saying about media attention. So the experiment in India was funded by UNICEF, right? How do you think that affected the way the media critiqued it or not, like the legitimacy of it?
I think it gave us a positive spin because UNICEF is well respected and they see that it's not funded by any vested interest or private agency, just a nice UNICEF. So it was a positive thing. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. We have woman in the
Short
center.
answer.
Okay. Good. Good for you. Okay. Okay. Woman in yellow.
Thank you. My name is Nicolina. I have a brief question, I hope, and that relates to, should universal basic income be paid to everyone independent of what their current wages are? And I'm asking this question because it's one I don't quite understand myself. And whenever I talk about basic income with anyone else, that's the first thing they ask me, and I don't really know how to justify to give money to people who already have what they need.
Perhaps I can give a short answer. I know people who argue for both sides of this question, and I can understand the arguments. I think there is some psychological aspects. Mathematically, it's perhaps not making much difference, but psychologically, so perhaps, especially in the beginning, when you make this de-learning experience, it could be very important that you really get the $1,000 or whatever on your bank account. And we found that with the winners of the My Basic Income, that if getting that once makes you getting that twice makes you and getting it the third month it sinks down. And this is really a similar experience. So for de-learning, I think that getting it really in your hand makes a difference. On the long run, I think it doesn't make. I personally favor models that also think it together and not as a one or the other thing. So for example, everybody has the right to get it in cash, but if you know that you have a high tax debt, you can also just keep it on the tax office as a tax, how do you say that? Credit. And so you can just mix the models also. So I like not to see it as a this or that question.
Can I add a bit more, please, Karl?
Oh well, I've got to keep this really short. I've got like 8 other people who want to ask questions.
First of all, it's got to be inclusive, so you've got to include wealth people. Secondly, it's cheaper administratively to give everybody the basic income and then claw it back afterwards. You can claw back more than you give them so they don't actually become better off. And the other thing is that if wealthy people get benefit, they will protect it, and they will protect it for poor people, which the current system doesn't do.
Okay, good. Very short. Okay, woman with pink hair.
Yes. Are there any data from the pilot and campaign that looks into the effects on voluntary work, that people getting the basic income do more or less voluntary work? Is there any like non-paid labor? No data collected on that?
You mean voluntary work, impact on more people are doing voluntary work?
People that are getting basic income, do you see any effect on their participation in voluntary work and giving back to community?
I mean, I just quickly answer this question. I think I like the metaphor he used, that go and see that mountain and come back and tell us.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
it's so we don't know that world where there would be basic income for all. So in our pilot, one experience we had was that 13 young boys who were like stunned by the fact that they were getting the money in their account. They were quite anxious not to spend it. I mean, they didn't want to spend it. They were very stunned. They didn't have cash like that for a long time, or maybe never. And then 6 months out into the basic income, they decided to start a fish cooperative and use the local village pond to start a fish cooperative, buy fish seeds, and then start doing that. And then they started selling it. 4 years down the road, we went back to see what happened to that fish cooperative, because the study was for 1 year. They were still continuing and doing good business, but then they put all the money in the bank for 2 years. They didn't know what to do with the money, because they didn't want to take the money, because pond belonged to it was the commons. So then they decided, why put the money in the bank, then start giving interest-free loans to farmers, small farmers. So it has activated something that we didn't expect at all. Now, I don't know if it's voluntary work or it's not-profit work.
Okay, it is something that experiments can and should be keeping track of. I don't know if they all are. Nicole.
Yes, hi, I'm Nicole from the French Movement for Basic Income. I really like the idea of campaigning in favor of a pilot that would be the perfect model for you, because in France there's been several attempts to make a pilot, and then they deviated to other proposals. So what I understand from what you said, Karl, was like, if we can support a proposal that would be like 5,000 people on a saturated site, that would be perfect. But then you say that the budget should be larger than any other pilot. But then I don't understand why, because I think that there's the issue also that it could frighten the politicians and maybe also the citizens, because they would say that it's not realistic enough. So what are your arguments?
Oh, so question's actually for me rather than well, you're getting my initial reaction from him. Is that, and that's of course the difficult strategic game, which I'm sure you're thinking this out. Well, we're going to have a campaign, and we can design it. We can have a campaign for what we really want, because a lot of the experiments we have are underfunded. There hasn't been a developed world study nearly as large as Sime-Dime since Sime-Dime closed in 1980. And we need a bigger experiment, and it should include a saturation site, but it shouldn't be just a saturation site, because that hasn't been done in the wealthy world since Manitoba closed theirs, also around 1980. So it's important to get something you want, a good big experiment to collect a robust amount of data. We've had some experiments that are like 500 people and not enough to collect what you want to collect. But you do have the trade-off of, well, the bigger you make it, are you going to make it too dangerous, and then it'll fail? Because if you don't want it to fail. You know, you want this is something that's a popular idea, and that's the difficult strategic question. And I'm sure they're already 10 steps ahead of me. So maybe, I don't know. You want to react to that, Joy?
No, it's fine. I'm totally agree with you. I want to have it very big, and I want to have a saturated site, a rural one and an urban one. So I think Sime-Dime is one of the is a blueprint.
Yeah, like
still, is it 50? It's a shame that the blueprint is still 50 years old.
Yeah, a combination of Sime-Dime and Mincome.
And Minna,
Yeah.
That's still a reference.
Yeah. Well, okay. Man with heavy jacket.
We heard this morning that Borgerlønn, or the pilot, is not a revolution, not a cosmic, or we say it another way, not a chaos and a cosmic or a logos. Also, it is something between. And it has to be a mutation. Because I believe everybody thinks that if one country is able to start this, then it's done. Then it will go on. But the problem is that there is too high step for every country to do this. And my question is then, it's very interesting to hear from different countries and pilots. I think it must be two ways. One way is this mutation will go to the simple persons that have right positions, that they suddenly will be convinced. A certain way of lobbyism, that it's possible that a certain amount of positional people are convinced. That is the one, and the other one is how to, maybe we must part a country. And now I say something short about the Norwegian, that's not very nice to say. Norway is like eating a whole fish, and you have the head down there, and you have all these bones up around. And if I have, and this might be
Make it really short.
yeah. This might be a direct question. The man behind me.
Please finish.
Yeah, that is the other way might be that we have to part the countries, and because there are little people in North Norway, we have to do it first in North Norway. Yeah.
Okay.
I hope you understand.
That sounds good advice. You have answers? Yes.
Yeah, I think what we discussed here in the big saal this morning is that is it possible even to have a national basic income model, or should we discuss a global model? Because, for example, in Finland, if we wanted to have basic income, we would have kind of discussed what does it mean in the context of European Union? How are we going to finance it? We are already having quite a lot of tax burden on taxpayers, those who are in labor jobs or wherever. So it's a huge question. We can have an experiment and pilot. It's very interesting and for a researcher, for example. But actually talking about basic income, then we come to very big questions, global-wide questions.
Okay, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to take the last 3 questions as a triplet. So 3 short questions, and then we'll get 3 short answers. So the first of 3 is Antonis.
Okay, yeah. So it has been briefly mentioned before that one of the benefits of basic income is that you can devote, that you can devote enough time into volunteering without having to search for a bullshit job in order to cover your volunteering. So my question is kind of an inception. If you're really into basic income and you want to volunteer full-time, so to speak, how would it be possible to create a paid job for yourself, given that we don't have yet a basic income, in order to promote basic income?
Okay, Scott Santon.
Which is very...
Want to answer that question?
No, we're taking them as a triplet.
Yeah, so my question is, Give directly reached out to me a few months ago with a very large list of things that they were planning to measure in their first major survey. And they asked me, what, if anything, would I add to that list that's missing? And so I found that really interesting, because also they were pushing up against the time limit as far as that, we can't like sit down with people for 15 hours asking them questions. Like there's a certain limited amount of questions you can ask someone in the experiment, especially when you're translating. So the question was, what would I add? So I would like to put that question to you as well, and also even to the audience to take away to think about that. So what if you could add one thing to an experiment? What would you choose? What one thing would you like to add to an experiment as far as what we would measure?
Okay, and it starts with a P, Peter, right?
Peter, yeah.
Okay.
Very quick to Minna. You said that the reason they confined the experiment in Finland was a purely bureaucratic one. Was there no political considerations that were forced on you? Or were those parameters set purely by what the bureaucracy could take? On choosing to do it with unemployed people already receiving a benefit.
So you mean the constraints?
Yeah.
Should I start?
Yes.
Okay,
Simple.
what to measure? First up, I would ask whether they actually knew that they were in the experiment, in the survey, because I'm not in the register-based analysis, but in the survey I would ask them whether they actually knew that they were in the experiment, because I think some of them, at least in the beginning, they actually didn't know. When you receive a letter from Karl, you may not open it because they knew something never very good. And they actually, we know from the registers that they actually registered as unemployed job seekers. So I don't. It's quite confusing whether people know what basic income is, whether they knew what the experiment means. Some actually said that they don't want to be in the experiment. Please take them away. They didn't want the money because they were going to work, because they felt like they are getting something they don't really deserve. And for the other question, yeah, there were probably also something political, but mainly it was because there was not enough time. The money issue was of course political issue. The researchers wanted to have 100 million euros and we got 20 million euros. So but I think some of the, or most of the constraints could have been kind of solved if there was enough time.
I have a couple answers.
Okay.
Okay. So to Scott's question, I would include a measure of stigma somehow. I think we stigmatize and marginalize a lot of people in society, and I think that basic income would change that. I haven't really seen any of the experiments measure that, although I think it would be incredibly hard to measure. I mean, they measure social connectedness and related things, not stigma. To answer a previous question that was asked about unpaid work, so I mentioned that we did this kind of rogue, renegade follow-up survey of anybody we could find who had been a participant for advocacy purposes, and we found that 25% of people in the recipient category said that they had volunteered more after receiving basic income, so it's kind of an informal, anecdotal response, but there you go. And then the last question about part of a country being able to implement this is something we struggle with in Canada. We have a very large country, very big differences between the provinces. And sometimes a province will try to come up with a way to do it themselves. I don't know how that would be possible at all, because we have some provinces are net winners and net losers economically, and they give and take to each other, and I don't know if they would be able to, but I think it's a worthy question.
Okay, Sarath?
Okay, I'll start with your question. That I think the way, how do you get a paid job in order to do voluntary work? You say, can I do it only with basic income? By reducing your consumption. By reducing your consumption, you can put full time into volunteering, so that you don't need a paid job at all. I don't know.
I'll try. when getting basic.
Coming back to Scott's question. Scott, I think one of the things we saw in our study is that the psychological, the emancipatory effect is several times more than the monetary value. The emancipatory value of a basic income is several times more than the monetary value that we actually gave. So I would be really interested in, instead of saying that stress levels were down and this small little thing, say that what was the psychological impact on people when they get a regular income stream, even for a short period of time. So if the baseline can capture the previous situation, and the subsequent surveys and the qualitative narratives can capture what actually happens to people in their minds, what is that emancipation? What are they liberated from? Why do they feel better? Why do they feel free? Because we saw that it has done something we couldn't really capture that in our study. That I would like to see.
Okay, we are over time. Do you have something desperate to say, and then we'll wrap it up?
Just two short aspects to Scott's question. I would include political activity. So, are you going to vote? Are you in any way engaged in the civil society? Because that's really a good argument if we find that for politicians to implement basic income, if that would be increased. And I would absolutely ask any pilots to include all the people, not only the poor one, not the unemployed, and measure the effects on the psychosocial side, also to the people who don't gain financially, because the other gains have to be measured, and by everyone in the society, not only some poor guys.
Very briefly, I would like people to ask about their self-esteem, about their sense of confidence, and particularly about their sense of outgoing and being non-judgmental to other people, because that's going to be so important to bring a coherent society of solidarity where people actually care about each other. And I think that's very important. Trust is one important part of that.
All right, thank you very much.